My view is that insofar as you make inequality of wealth worse, you're making democracy harder. My name's Timothy Snyder. I'm a historian at Yale University. I've also written a couple of books about the present. One of them is called A Road to Unfreedom, and maybe the best known is On Tyranny. Leaders like Mr. Trump, for example, who use fascist tactics and fascist rhetoric, but don't have the full fascist packet. That is, they don't invade other countries. They don't really have a mission. They're kind of lazy. Then you see that this thing we have now, I think, is much more closely connected to a certain kind of capitalism, a capitalism which says it's okay for there to be radical inequality. And Mr. Trump has certainly done that with tax cuts. He's also done that by actively dismantling what remains of the American welfare state. The authoritarianism part, though, can also be advanced without the capitalism part. And here I would focus on his active campaign to dismantle the idea of truth, his active campaign to dismantle scientific authority, factuality, journalism, all the little well springs of facts and truth that citizens need to have if politics is going to be something beyond just emotions and us and them.
We often hear how, for example, the idea of the triumph of the West in Eastern Europe meant a return to democracy and free markets, all in one word. Free markets, of course, being a buzzword for capitalism. I'm Jack Powells, and I'm the author of a book on the rise of Hitler. It's called Big Business and Hitler. So we're asked to believe is that capitalism likes democracy and democracy wants capitalism. And as an historian, I must say it hasn't been like that at all. Capitalism was not born in the context of democracy. In fact, I would argue that more often than not, it has not done so well in the context of democracy. And conversely, capitalism has done very, very well in the context of authoritarian systems, including the most awful of all authoritarian systems, namely Hitler's Nazism.
This year they say there are 800,000 pairs of boots standing heel to heel, waiting for the Führer's final speech. And the high spot comes when, after a detailed review of Nazi achievements, Hitler cries, "My life's fight has not been in vain."
Indem ich euch ihre Blicke weise ich, mein Lebenskampf ist nicht umsonst gekämpft.
All the evidence shows that capitalism liked Nazism, an extremely authoritarian system.
Soll vor sich hertragen und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen.
And this is where I'd like to begin, with the rise and reign of the Nazis from the 1920s onwards, because it's the strongest precedent that shows how capitalism and authoritarianism can, and I stress can, flourish together and feed off each other.
Mein Lebenskampf ist nicht umsonst gekämpft.
In the early 1920s, Hitler was a failed artist and had fallen in with a small anti-Semitic political party called the National Socialists.
It is true that he was, in many ways, a nobody, and that he was the leader of only a very insignificant small party, based mostly in Munich, but after the war. And he quickly got in touch with people with money, industrialists, for example, in Munich, who gave him money. And the idea that Hitler was a worker, a proletarian, so to speak, is absolute nonsense. That's a myth. He was actually very soon a rich man. And he became rich because of his contacts with rich people who saw something in him and didn't necessarily see him at that stage as the future leader of Germany, as they would like to see Germany. But he found him, he was very useful because his men, the men under his command, were very brutal. You know, they were the stormtroopers, and they were very handy to combat the communists and socialists in the streets.
Hitler's rise during the 1920s and early 30s coincided with the chaos in Germany after the First World War, widespread poverty, the growing and militant socialist and communist parties, and trade unions pressing for increased power. All this alarmed Germany's wealthy elite, which was also haunted by the specter of the 1917 Russian Revolution.
So there was a great fear among the capitalists of Western Europe that there might be a similar revolution à la Russe in their own countries. Therefore, they were looking for ways to prevent that. Political ways, of course, political movements that could combat the rise of socialism in general and communism in particular.
The Nazis had, at least in name, a pro-worker agenda. I think they even called for the nationalization of certain industries. But were they truly socialist?
No, Nazism was not socialist at all, in spite of the name. The idea that the whole name of the party was a fraud. Hitler called his party the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Well, it was German, all right, but it was not socialist at all. Hitler was not a socialist. He hated socialism with a vengeance, and he was not a worker. And actually, there was very few workers in his party. The reason why Hitler chose to call his party socialist when it was not has to do with the fact that socialism, in the context of the end of the First World War in the early 20s, was a very powerful word that had a lot of appeal to ordinary Germans.
Among Hitler's earliest supporters was Fritz Thyssen, a German industrial magnate and CEO of one of the country's largest steelmaking companies, United Steelworks.
Fritz Thyssen was one of the quintessential sort of captains of German industry after the war. He was one of the masters of the Ruhr, and the Ruhr area is the heartland, the industrial heartland, of Germany. So these gentlemen were involved in steel mills and coal mining, production of weapons, for example.
Another industrialist Hitler admired was Henry Ford.
He was anti-Semitic as Hitler. In fact, arguably more so because he wrote a book that provided Hitler with much of his inspiration called The International Jew. And Hitler liked that book a lot.
But throughout the 1920s, the bulk of Germany's business class ignored the Nazis.
The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange.
The crash of 1929 changed all that.
Are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market prices.
Capitalism was in trouble. Capitalism was in deep trouble with huge unemployment, therefore a lot of unhappy people. And at the same time, the Soviet Union was doing fairly well. Factory workers were looking towards the Soviet Union, and therefore more and more voting socialist or, God forbid, communist. And the only party that could gather popular votes, as the socialists and communists did, was the Nazi Party. Because nobody voted anymore for the traditional parties, which had been the favorites of industrialists and bankers until that time. And that then really forced, so to speak, the industrialists in a situation where, as they saw it, either they would support Hitler or the communists may come to power.
So most of Germany's leading companies threw their support behind Hitler and the Nazis, and for one major reason. So for the German business class, blaming the Jews as being the source of workers' problems was obviously more attractive than saying, we are the source of your problem.
Obviously, the communist explanation for the misery and the problems of the Great Depression was that it was the fault of the capitalists, right? That capitalism was the cause of all the misery. Whereas Hitler's explanation was that no, it's all the fault of the Jews. So if we get rid of the Jews, the problem is solved, and the German capitalism is safe. Is not bothered at all. And that's indeed what the great appeal for Hitler.
Beginning in 1930, Hitler held a series of private meetings with German industrialists who agreed to bankroll the Nazi Party. How much money was raised as a result of these meetings for the Nazi Party?
Well, nobody knows exactly the amounts because some donations were anonymous. It's not known for sure, meaning we don't know the exact amounts. But there are reports, for example, from the French Secret Services and from the French Embassy and from the American Embassy referring to big donations by German industrialists and bankers to Hitler, in the 30s prior to his coming to power. So the amounts were huge.
Which were the leading German companies that supported Hitler in this era, sort of the early 30s up until 1933?
The answer to that question is every single big German company, and I should say every single big company active in Germany, which means not necessarily German companies, but foreign companies, foreign, which were mostly American companies like IBM, ITT, Singer, famous for sewing machines, which made machine guns during the war in Germany, Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and so on.
meine Arbeit für richtig hältst.
Among the big German companies funding the Nazis were Siemens, IG Farben, the Dresdner Bank, Commerzbank, and the powerful arms maker and steel company Krupp.
Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten.
Hitler delivered this speech at the Krupp factory in the city of Essen in 1935, and the support didn't stop with these companies.
The Union Bank of New York was a small bank in the late 1920s, early 30s. It was run by a fellow called Prescott Bush, the father of George Bush and the grandfather of George W. Bush. So the father and grandfather, respectively, of two presidents. He actually had a small bank in New York that specialized in basically German Reich bonds in the United States and therefore raising money for Hitler. But he was already a supporter of Hitler at an early stage. So the Bush family has antecedents, has connections with Hitler that go back to the 1920s.
After the Nazis came to power in 1933, Hitler immediately implemented a program that benefited his industrialist backers.
First of all, Hitler eliminates the communists and the socialists, and he eliminates the trade unions. So in a sense, within 6 months of Hitler coming to power, it's the end of the labor movement in Germany. And the labor movement in Germany was the leading labor movement and working class movement in all of Europe since the mid-1800s. So you might say that Hitler manages to do what industrialists could only have dreamed of through themselves, namely, basically roll back all the gains made by the labor movement in the late 19th and early 20th century.
The Gazette presents the first actual pictures to reach this country of the German troop movements, which have caused the big...
Hitler also began a rearmament program.
Where does it all lead? To a new war or to a shorter peace?
Hitler wants a war. He's preparing for war. He starts ordering trucks and so on from Ford and General Motors in Germany and BMW and all these boys, right? He starts ordering guns from Krupp. So Germany's going to have a war. They all know that. There's going to be a war against the Soviet Union, of course, which everybody hates. Industrialists hate the Soviet Union. Bankers hate the Soviet Union. And Hitler hates the Soviet Union.
By his latest act of naked aggression, Hitler has committed a crime not only against Poland, but against the whole human race. Already German troops, guns and planes have crossed the Polish border to kill and to destroy. So Britain prepares to fight.
After the Second World War started, the Nazis' use of slave labor throughout its prison camps would soon benefit the companies which had backed Hitler.
But we shall be fighting for something which is vital to our life and to the life of all civilized people.
Every one of them used slave labor. I had never come across one company that didn't during the war. In this context, many German companies, especially the big boys, set up factories near concentration camps, which were, of course, where most of the slave labor congregated, so to speak. So, for example, BMW, a famous car manufacturer, which is actually short for Bayerische Motorwerke, the Bavarian Motor Works, and they actually relied a lot on labor supplied by the first concentration camp that was set up by the Nazis in 1933 already. And that was in the town of Dachau, which is only about not even 10 kilometers from Munich. Siemens relied on slave labor, I believe, from Ravensbrück, which is a concentration camp not too far from where Berlin is.
But at the end of the war, most of Germany's industrialists escaped punishment for their collusion with the Nazis.
Nothing happened. Most of them were not bothered at all because they used the excuse that they had no choice or were forced by the Nazi party, by the Nazis, to use slave labor. And that has led to kind of a myth that German industrialists and bankers were really, during the war, they just found themselves caught where they were forced to do the admittedly awful things they did.
Judges from Britain, America, Russia, and France assemble in Nuremberg's courthouse. Empowered to impose sentence of death, or such punishment as it may consider just, the tribunal sits in judgment upon 20 leaders of the Nazi Party.
At the end of the Second World War, the United States looked around the world and told itself, we are the only country that has not been sapped politically and economically and morally and militarily by this war.
Opening the Allied case against the defendants, Chief American Prosecutor Justice Jackson.
Of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility.
Therefore, it's our obligation to lead the world. I'm Stephen Kinzer. I'm a professor of international relations at Brown University. I was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, and I've written a series of books about America's role in the world. There was a famous article written by Henry Luce, the publisher of Time magazine, called The American Century. And he called directly on the United States to assume the role of global leadership. He wrote, "Now it becomes our time to be the powerhouse." In other words, the world should follow the successful example of the United States.
The United States emerged from the war not only as an economic and military juggernaut, but with imperial ambitions. In 1947, the Truman administration created the Central Intelligence Agency.
Even the very sick record their votes in the Italian elections. So great are the issues involved that 90% of the electorate goes to the ballot box. Pietro Neni, to whom 40 British members of Parliament addressed a telegram of goodwill, is very optimistic. He has allied his left-wing socialists with the forces of the Communist Party. With this aid, Palmiro Togliatti, Communist leader, anticipates a combined majority over the government parties.
The Americans were terrified that communists would come to power through democratic means. And the first major CIA operation carried out in 1948, the year after the CIA was founded, was actually in Italy. And it was aimed specifically at trying to obstruct an electoral process that looked like it might produce a communist government in Italy. So the CIA devoted enormous resources to a project in which all sorts of books and documents were printed. Propaganda was placed in Italian newspapers. Italian Americans were organized to send letters to their relatives to tell them that all U.S. aid to Italy would be cut off if the communists won the election. And this was a successful campaign. The communists then did lose that election.
From 1945 until the early 2000s, the United States intervened in approximately 80 significant elections around the world. It also invaded or organized coups in dozens of countries. About a quarter of nations within the capitalist world changed government as a result of U.S. interventions between the mid-1950s and 70s.
The U.S. saw the world, and I'm speaking not just about the government of the U.S., but American people, as being caught up in a great battle between two tremendous forces. One was the world of communism led from Moscow. The other was the world, as we called it, the free world, led from Washington.
Well, so how much of these regime changes were made to help or protect the corporate interests of American companies?
You come into conflict with a corporation that is in your country, that's making a lot of money, and that feels threatened by democratic politics. That company then goes to Washington and complains. That sets in motion the regime change. So the U.S. has always preferred authoritarian governments to ones that are democratic and open. In fact, when you look at the governments we've overthrown, in many cases, they're more democratic than the governments we support. And we often replace them with governments that are harsher and more authoritarian. And the reason is very simple. We carry out these operations so that the leaders of these countries will follow American dictates. And that's the whole point of the exercise.
Attention is focused once again on the Middle East, where events in Iran have taken a dramatic double twist. Forced to flee his palace in Tehran, the Shah and his queen arrive in Rome after an alleged attempt by the Imperial Guard to arrest Dr. Mossadegh and a refusal by the Shah to dissolve Parliament at Mossadegh's request.
Iran was a democracy when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh came to power in 1951, with popular support to nationalize the country's oil sector.
And then the people themselves took a hand. 300 killed and hundreds wounded is a conservative estimate.
It came at a time when Iran was emerging from a long period of dictatorship. Iran had finally developed a democratic political system, and Iranians had elected a very formidable figure, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh, like leaders in most developing countries at that time, was focused mainly on national development and democracy, nationalism and democracy. Nationalism meant we have to control our oil resource. Iran is sitting on an ocean of oil, but at that time, the entire oil industry was owned by the British. All the profits went to Britain. And democracy meant that the people elected by voters and by parliament should rule. The Americans were also terrified that if Iran could get away with nationalizing its oil, other countries in the rest of the world would begin nationalizing their resources. And the next thing you know, the entire system by which the world is run economically could dissolve. So the CIA and the British Secret Service swung into action. Mossadegh was overthrown in August of 1953. I've written a book about this, All the Shah's Men. If you look at it in the short run, you could judge it as a success. We got rid of a guy we didn't like, Mossadegh, and we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we wanted. So it seemed like the perfect solution. But if you look back over the course of history, things haven't really worked out that well.
For Khomeini, the flight from Paris to Tehran marked the end of 15 years in exile.
For the next 25 years, the Shah, with help from the CIA, ran an increasingly repressive and corrupt regime, which finally led to a popular uprising in 1979.
Khomeini, almost unknown outside of Iran just a few months ago, returned a hero, the man who from long distance had led the revolution to topple the Shah. Inside the airport terminal...
That revolution brought to power a clique of fanatically anti-American mullahs who proceeded to spend the next 40 years intensely and sometimes quite violently opposing American interests all around the world.
In an obvious reference to the United States, he said, foreign advisors have ruined our culture and have taken our oil.
Ideas in the Afternoon continues in a moment. Stay with us.
What had been a well-planned arrival ceremony soon turned into chaos as Khomeini, riding in an American-made car, led a motorcade through the city.
It's 2:30. You're listening to CBC Radio 1. I'm Joanne Bailey with the news headlines for Quebec. Quebec City's University Hospital Network is canceling 4,000 outpatient appointments and 300 surgeries per week until further notice. The move is to reallocate hospital staff to tackle COVID-19 because the rising number of cases is putting too much pressure on the system. Meanwhile, Quebec is reporting more than 1,500 new cases of COVID-19 today. And with the numbers steadily growing, some experts are calling on the government to implement a full 2-week lockdown. Weather forecast now from Environment Canada. In Montreal, it's currently -3, mainly cloudy today. We're expecting a high of -1, a wind chill this afternoon of -7. Tonight, mainly cloudy with a low of -4. In Quebec City, mainly cloudy today, high of 0. Right now it's -2, and the wind chill will reach -8 this afternoon. Tonight, mainly cloudy with a low of -7. In the eastern townships, cloudy today, scattered flurries, a high of -4, a wind chill of -11. Tonight, mainly cloudy, isolated flurries, and a low of -7. In the Gaspé, periods of snow today, strong winds from the northwest, temperature -1, with the wind chill this afternoon of -8 degrees.
I'm Nala Ayed. Welcome back to Ideas in the F and to a documentary called Money Rules. Is Capitalism Destroying Democracy? By contributor Bruce Livesey.
In 1951, the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz came to power in Guatemala. At the time, Guatemala's economy was dominated by the American multinational, the United Fruit Company, the same one which produces Chiquita bananas.
United Fruit was the dominant force in Guatemala during the 30s and 40s and 50s. It was much more powerful than the government of Guatemala. The United Fruit Company, through other subsidiaries, also controlled the country's electric power system, and it controlled the only port. And in addition, the railroad line that ran from other places in the country out to the port. So you couldn't export anything, essentially, out of Guatemala unless you were dealing with United Fruit because you couldn't get to the port. And electric power was completely in the hands of this foreign-owned company. Previous governments had cooperated willingly with United Fruit, but when democracy arrived in Guatemala, starting in the mid-1940s, things started to go badly for United Fruit. Actually, President Arbenz had the same idea in Guatemala that Prime Minister Mossadegh had in Iran. That was, we need to take control of our main resources. Our resource should be the source of wealth and development for our country. It shouldn't be exploited for the profit of foreigners. So the Guatemalan Congress passed a land reform act under which unused land owned by United Fruit, and it owned several 100,000 acres that it didn't use, could be bought, and that land would then be parceled out in small pieces to landless families. This was seen as a body blow to United Fruit.
But the United Fruit Company had powerful friends in the Eisenhower administration.
Fighting ends in Guatemala. These rebel troops, backed by air power, have compelled the ousting of Guatemala's pro-communist regime and have won a...
And the CIA did organize a major operation in the spring of 1954, which ultimately led to the overthrow of Arbenz. We then imposed a military ruler. That led to a civil war in Guatemala that lasted 30 years and cost the lives of about 200,000 people, most of them poor, unarmed Mayan peasants. More people than were killed in political violence in all the rest of Latin America combined during the 60s and 70s and 80s. And all the roots of that can be traced back to the American refusal to allow a democratic government in the Cold War context of that time to take root in the 1950s.
The Berlin Wall, once it divided East from West, now on its way to becoming an artifact of history.
But the end of the Cold War didn't necessarily mean a golden age for democracy, at least not in countries like Russia. In the year 2000, a former KGB agent, Vladimir Putin, became Russia's president. His initial goal was to stabilize the country, but his actual impact is another question.
All in all, what Mr. Putin has done is affirm an oligarchy, but a non-competitive oligarchy, what some people would prefer to call kleptocracy.
Yale historian Timothy Snyder.
Under President Yeltsin in the 90s, Russia was a much freer country. There was much greater freedom of press. There was much more unpredictability. And there were rival clans of oligarchs. What Mr. Putin has done is assert himself as the oligarch in chief and use the organs of the state to crowd out all the oligarchs who didn't come to an acceptable deal with him. So he's created I'd call it a semi-permanent, because it's going to break soon, but he's created a semi-permanent form of oligarchy where there's just one clan rather than competing clans. And that one clan controls both politics and the economy.
Putin was influenced by the writings of an obscure Russian political philosopher named Ivan Ilyin, who came of age in the period just after the 1917 Russian Revolution. About the Nazis' rise to power, Ilyin once wrote,
Germans were able to break the democratic deadlock. Those who do not like the new spirit are being pulled out. This spirit is the substance of this whole movement. It burns in the hearts of every true National Socialist. It flexes his muscles, rings in his words, and shines in his eyes.
Ivan Ilyin was a very interesting Christian fascist thinker of the first half of the 20th century, similar to some Romanian fascists, largely unknown outside of Russia. In the 20s and 30s, Ivan Ilyin made the case that Russia was the country which was going to save the world, that the fatal fragmented condition of the world, this world that we live in with all of its messy facts and its different interpretations and its emotions that can't be reconciled to one another, all of this nasty, made the case that Russia was the country which was going to save the world, that the fatal fragmented condition of the world, this world that we live in with all of its messy facts and its different interpretations and its emotions that can't be reconciled to one another, all of this nasty pluralism of fact and value, that Russia was the country which would come and make everything back into a unity, that Russia was the country which would basically return God to earth and make everything perfect by making it total and united. So when I was writing Road to Unfreedom, what I saw was that there actually were people in the Kremlin, including Mr. Putin, who were reading Ivan Ilyin, and that Ivan Ilyin's statements and that his worldview were coming out explicitly and implicitly.
So what sort of state has Putin created?
I would characterize it as an oligarchy with moments of Christian fascism. It's an oligarchy with moments of imperialism. I mean, you're stressing capitalism. I think it's also important to stress that some of the technologies of capitalism, like both television and the internet, can be mobilized in order to help authoritarian rulers. So it's a media-centered oligarchy, which has some fascist moments and which has some imperial moments.
By 2010, Russia's form of oligarchic capitalism was being adopted in countries like Hungary, Turkey, Poland, and then, in 2016, the United States.
Fox News Decision Desk, Donald Trump will be the 45th President of the United States. The most unreal, surreal election.
His administration believes the president cannot be checked. And they've made that argument in the courts, and they've made it in the bully pulpit. My name is Andrea Bernstein. I'm an investigative journalist and the author of American Oligarchs, The Kushners, The Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power. And I am the co-host of the Trump Inc. podcast. So it's a kind of a devil's bargain, which is to say Trump gets his very strong unitary executive power, and the very wealthy get the things they want, which is the ability basically to make even more money than they have. And those two forces are combining to erode the strictures that American democracy has put in against authoritarianism.
As a New York-based journalist, Andrea Bernstein has spent years digging into the finances of Donald Trump and another New York real estate family, the Kushners. In 2009, these two real estate dynasties merged when Jared Kushner married Ivanka Trump.
So their wedding, this spectacular display of money and power, and people who are governors come, police commissioners, attorneys general, legislators from all over the country. These are people who could or might be able to give Donald Trump a tax break or bend a regulation, or who, in some cases, might investigate him if anything came up. And all of these people, they come to this wedding, and it's a display of the power that Donald Trump has over his family, that Donald Trump has over the world.
Yet long before the 2016 election, America was already becoming an oligarchy.
For the last 50 or so years, there's been a consistent erosion of checks on the influence of money and power. So when the framers of the U.S. Constitution were writing the Constitution, they were so concerned about the possibility of corruption. They thought it was as big a threat to the incipient democracy as war. So, and they were pretty careful in their understanding that human beings are going to be tempted to be corrupted, and that the way to prevent that was not to sort of eliminate the desire to do corrupt things, to make money, which they understood was part of human nature, but rather to put in place systems that would limit those temptations. And this has ebbed and flowed in the history of the United States over the last 200 or so years. But what has happened since this, in the kind of last quarter of the last century and the beginning of this century, is that a lot of those strictures, which were designed to limit temptation, have been swept away. So, for example, in the campaign finance system, it's become easier and easier and easier to pour money into our political system. Concurrently, and not coincidentally, taxes on the wealthy have been lowered and lowered and lowered. So what does that mean? That means very wealthy people have a lot of extra money sloshing around that they can put into the political system to try to bend it in their direction.
That sloshing around of money in American politics would become a virtual flood when big business and Republicans challenged the U.S. Supreme Court to allow corporations and labor unions to spend as much money as they wanted on influencing the outcome of elections. In 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor in a decision called Citizens United. What's been the impact of decisions such as that?
It cannot be overstated what a deleterious effect on American political discourse the Citizens United decision has had. So this was a case that was concerning whether outside corporations should be able to inject advertisements into political discourse right before an election. And there had up to that time been a rule which wasn't always kept, but basically was the understanding was that campaigns spent money, and money had to be spent through campaigns, and it had to be carefully disclosed. And that outside groups, if they wanted to spend money, had to limit coordination. After Citizens United, which essentially said, yeah, corporations have free speech in America, it became possible for money to just flood into the system. The levees were broken by Citizens United.
Citizens United. And essentially would say anything goes. There are no rules in terms of how to finance campaigns.
In fact, it was even worse than Obama predicted.
There aren't a lot of functioning democracies around the world that work this way.
Billions and billions of dollars began to be spent on advertisements.
And what it means is ordinary Americans are shut out of the process.
And almost all of them were funding and promoting a libertarian view, which was there should be no government, that government was horrible. And I was traveling in some swing states, and there were so many advertisements saying such and such member of Congress is a crook, such and such member of Congress stole your money. So, of course, what happens when Donald Trump comes in is that there's a very receptive audience for the argument he's making, which is that everything just needs to be burned down.
Andrea, when you look at the trajectory of politics and wealth distribution in America since the 1980s, where do you think the arrow points? Are we seeing the emergence of a form of authoritarian capitalism or even fascism?
While I was working on my book, I felt this incredible sense of dread, because the more I looked at these families and the way that they had structured their deals and structured their lives so that they could win at others' expense, and the more I realized that knowing these families as I knew them, I had to ask myself, what would happen if there was a real crisis facing this country? What would they do? And the answer I had to give myself is more of the same of what they've done, but that is obviously not going to solve the crises that are before us right now.
This idea of capitalism and democracy going hand in hand, does that apply anymore?
Well, I think something we've come to learn is just how fragile democracy is and how it's not something that comes up every day like the sun. It has to be constantly built.
Hundreds of protesters had been gathered peacefully in Lafayette Park just outside the White House, chanting and holding signs.
Mounted police have been coming down the street using flashbangs in front of them and mounted police to clear what has been an entirely peaceful protest here today. There was no throwing of water bottles.
So do these kinds of oligarchs also exist here in Canada?
So what we see in America, we also see it to an extent in Canada, is the few are being able to gather together the natural resources under their control, especially in specific sectors, mining, oil and gas, and the extractive industries. I'm Donald Bowser. I'm an international anti-corruption expert who spent the last 30 years in the former Soviet Union and 20 of which working on corruption. So when we look at the classic understanding of oligarchy in which the few have all the power, what we've seen is a 19th century model of robber barons, and that went to a more even distribution of wealth and power across many different divergent interests. And now what we're seeing is the same collection again going towards the 19th century in which the few are able to gather together both political and economic power in their hands.
When Donald Bowser was growing up in New Brunswick, he took an interest in the Soviet Union, where he eventually went to study in 1990. There, he saw firsthand the transformation from socialism to capitalism and the rise of the oligarchic class. After the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, where did the oligarchs, these new oligarchs, come from?
Well, they came mostly from the Young Communist League, the Komsomol. So most of them originally had some access to things that people wanted. Movie theaters, ice cream parlors, things that could actually generate liquid cash very quickly. Then they moved on to, in terms of getting the state assets. So they would specifically target going after state resources, using the cash that they had available, right? Sell jeans on the streets, and then you would buy aluminum or gold or diamonds, whatever you could get your hands on. And then you would turn this into large amounts of cash. With that large amount of cash, then you would be able to capture specifically parts of the economy. So the oligarch system developed out of mobilizing resources from the state and turning natural resources that belong to everybody into incredible economic power, and then they spread out horizontally.
Donald Bowser studied international relations and languages in Europe before joining a global anti-corruption agency called Transparency International. By 2001, he was a globe-trotting anti-corruption consultant working in countries like Ukraine, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Tajikistan, and Russia. In 2006, he returned to live in Atlantic Canada. So, Don, you spend 20 years traveling the globe doing anti-corruption work, and then you return to Atlantic Canada. What do you find there?
Well, what I found that was most shocking is the same type of models that existed in Eastern Europe exist in the Maritimes, especially in terms of New Brunswick, in which you see a very few players being able to monopolize the province's assets. So what you saw, instead of state capture as they defined it within Eastern Europe, you saw province capture, in which policy is generated by a few oligarchs, in the classic sense of the word, who are able to dominate both the economic and political scene. What I saw was exactly the same model. Being able to access the province's resources and being able to strip away those resources and tunnel them out of the country.
Bowser soon became fascinated with the Irvings, one of Canada's richest families.
Welcome back. Mention the Irvings and everyone has an opinion. Generally, it's a strong one. What is it about this family that causes such reactions?
The Irving Empire was founded in the 1920s by Kenneth Collin, or K.C. Irving, and has dominated New Brunswick so thoroughly that it's often referred to as a company province.
Their choice is simple. Take the Irving offer or stay unemployed. It's part of the Irving way of doing business, what the Irvings call tough but fair.
Today, the empire is run by Casey's sons and grandchildren.
They are three of the most powerful businessmen in the country. Jim Irving, shipyard and forestry magnate. Jack Irving, the top man in the Irving Construction Division. And Arthur Irving, the head of Irving Oil. Together, the three brothers control a web of businesses so complex, so diverse, and so private, no one knows for sure just how big they are or how much they're worth. They avoid the media spotlight.
The Irving family operates as many as 250 companies, which are valued at an estimated $10 billion. Their empire controls energy, transportation, food, forestry, construction, and media holdings throughout New Brunswick.
The model that we see with the Irvings was following on from the robber barons of the 19th century, right? They were able to take a small amount of economic activity in terms of the oil sector, and then continually use that to gobble up more and more resources within the province, not only in terms of natural resources, but able to grab more and more of the economy under their domination. Nobody knows the actual size of their holdings because New Brunswick has failed to pass a beneficial ownership law. So there's a lot of numbered companies in New Brunswick, far in excess of any other jurisdiction that I know of. So it makes it almost impossible. So it's very difficult to know how much of the economy they actually own, but it's clear that they own the majority of the economy. And they use this monopolies to continue to put pressure on anybody else who might threaten their interests.
Fellow New Brunswickers, tonight the road is clear. Nous voyons plus clair maintenant.
The province's current premier, Blaine Higgs, who won a majority government in September 2020, is a former Irving Oil manager who spent more than 30 years working for the company.
The Irvings don't need to buy anybody. They don't need to pay bribes to anybody within the New Brunswick government because they get what they want for free. So by continually demanding that what they want is good for New Brunswick and good for creating jobs, they get almost everything they want. But at the end of it, you see continual a rise in New Brunswick's debt, you see continual job losses. So the whole history of this, there's been no economic benefit to New Brunswick to have this monopolistic system. But it's what they use to get more and more of what they want.
While the Irvings are among the richest families in Canada, New Brunswick is the poorest province, with the lowest median income, the highest migration out of the province, and the highest, or among the highest, per capita rates of poverty, illiteracy, unemployment, and suicide. Yet the reach of the Irvings continues to grow.
Ottawa's plan to bolster Canada's fleet of Arctic patrol ships is running full steam ahead.
What I would say to you is that sometimes it's what politicians don't say that's revealing. Like this week's announcement that the design phase of the shipbuilding project is getting underway.
Just this morning, we signed a definition contract for the Arctic offshore patrol vessels, and it's been awarded, of course, to Irving Shipbuilding.
While admitting most of the design work will be outsourced to Denmark, the players avoided a larger question. How many ships will be built in Halifax?
In 2011, the federal government gave Irving Shipbuilding the largest contract in Canadian history to build a new fleet of ships for the Navy, a contract whose price tag has soared from $25 billion to $70 billion and growing.
So what we've seen from some of the scandals that emerged in the last year, like with the Irving shipbuilding industry, is that Irving has continually started to grow their ability to control federal level policy. So we can see that there's direct connections between some of the New Brunswick members of the government and Irving interests, and that we see on the shipbuilding contract that they were able to have undue influence over this entire process. They're also able to threaten the press if the press writes anything nasty about them or tries to expose this. So it's clear that their lobbying abilities within the federal government is growing.
There are 3 daily English language newspapers in New Brunswick. The Irvings own all of them, as well as 17 community papers. In 2006, a Senate inquiry called the situation, quote, an industrial media complex, unquote.
This is exactly the model that the Russian oligarchs did, is once they had economic power, they wanted to grab media holdings. So they wanted to make sure that they had their hands on media to be able to control the message. What we've seen is that, especially in New Brunswick, you live in this info silo in which very few people look outside, right? A lot of chatter about lack of trust in mainstream media. So you have all of this information which is generated locally, which people then consume. So their ability to control the daily newspapers has incredible impact.
One of the areas the Irvings have also profited from is their influence on forestry policy.
The Irvings are big in forestry. They own huge tracts of forest and farmland, and they control even more. That's got a lot of people.
Most of the forests in New Brunswick are Crown land. The province leases most of its forests to the Irvings and other forestry companies. Yet the province charges so little in the way of fees that it actually loses money on the arrangement.
So we're giving away the resources. Right? It's the great resource giveaway that happens in New Brunswick. So in terms of straight democracy, you can vote. Nobody's stopping you from voting. There's no death squads. There's nothing like that. But there's also no transparency within many of the aspects of the system. And especially when we look at the election scandals, and I think back to a number of cases of where people have been caught fudging. So they are one of the most opaque jurisdictions that I've ever worked in. And I've worked in some of the most corrupt countries on the planet.
Make no mistake, the Irvings are in this game to win. They are tough, aggressive, and driven. For that, they make no apologies.
And the thing is, we don't like losing, and we want to play it fair, square, and on the top of the table. And that's the only game we play. And everybody knows that.
This is one of the most worrying things for me, is that we've had an erosion across Canada in terms of institutions. We don't have real anti-corruption agencies that are able to hold corrupt officials to account. We don't have the other accountability mechanisms that are truly independent. So there are no watchdogs. And without watchdogs, the danger of having a genuine authoritarian system emerge are there.
What's been lost in this latest chapter in the history of capitalism is massive, and it may not be easily restored.
I think the variant that we have comes out of the confrontation with the Soviet Union. Our posture, or the posture of many people in the West after 1989, after the end of communism in Europe, was its passivity. This idea that some larger historical force was going to come and do the work of democracy for us. Whereas, of course, democracy means the people ruling. The people have to want to rule. The people have to think about ruling. They have to decide how they want to rule, or else you're not going to keep democracy.
You are listening to Ideas and to a documentary called Money Rules: Is Capitalism Destroying Democracy by contributor Bruce Livesey.